Hello YouTube, welcome to my channel. My name is Joshua Young and today I'm going to be starting a short series on how to understand atheists. In particular, this video is going to be on why I originally became an atheist. I am no longer an atheist. I made a deal with God about 10 years ago, which you can find in my other video, which I will point out here. And that deal I made with God was basically, hey, I don't believe you're there, but if you are, I'm going to give you an opportunity to prove yourself to me. And so I got my deal met. And so now I am no longer an atheist. But I would like to explore a little bit about why I became an atheist in the first place. So that's what this video is about. Most of you have probably heard of the Golden Rule, which states that you should do unto other people as you would have them do unto you. I took this very literally when it came to the idea of talking to and understanding atheists. My thinking basically was that, well, if I want people to read books or watch YouTube videos that have to do with Christianity, or if I want somebody to come to church, I should be willing to do similar types of things with other people that I disagree with. So, obviously, I need to watch YouTube videos by atheists. I need to read books by atheists. And I need to engage with atheists in good faith. So this was the approach that I took when I began to study things. I was not studying things simply to debunk them, which I think is a mistake that a lot of people make. I don't think it's very safe to enter a discussion, or good to enter a discussion, by simply assuming that what you already think must be correct. It doesn't seem very honest, right? So it's probably better to approach the situation and think, all right, let's try to hear out the other side and really try to get a mental model built up of what that argument is and then proceed. So that's what I did. And in the process, I studied a lot of different topics. And during this video, I'm going to go through these topics. I'll break them up into chapters. And these chapters are going to be you can jump around to them, right? And we're going to go ahead and start with the first one here. And that is, what is an atheist? You've probably heard of Psalm 14:1 if you grew up in the church. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. And for most people who grew up in the Abrahamic religions, this is sort of the idea that is presented from when you're at a young age in church, is that anybody who just says there is no God is just being dumb, right? Is not being very intelligent about it. Well, I'm here to let you know that that is not the case. Most atheists are incredibly intelligent. They have thought things through substantially. And in some cases, I was surprised to find that some of the best atheists at debate were ones who were once Christians. So and I'm using atheists here to also encompass some of the agnostics as well. So people like Matt Dillahunty or Dan Barker or Bart Ehrman, who was very popular for a while with his books, and still is to some extent. They were all Christians, right? You know, they all grew up in the church and they knew all of the stuff. So it wasn't like they left the faith just because they were fools. That wasn't it, right? And so this was kind of shocking to me. I just thought it was going to be easy to talk to atheists about this stuff. And then I discovered that atheism wasn't just people who wanted to do bad things so they didn't believe in God. That wasn't it at all. Atheists in many cases had really good arguments, and this was really hard for me to grapple with because of some of the ways that I had been taught to think, or I had learned to think growing up. And so what do atheists actually think? Well, I think it's probably good to start with the definition that most atheists right now give about atheism. And the definition they give is that atheism is just a lack of belief in any gods. It's not that they in particular disbelieve in the Christian God. They just don't believe in any of them. And so you'll hear arguments like, well, you don't believe in Zeus or the Roman gods or any of the gods from the India, right? So I just believe in one less God. That's what they'll say, right? You know, I just don't believe in Yahweh or in Jesus as well. And so this is the normal definition that atheists will give for what atheism is. Now, at the time, I didn't really understand that there was an implicit assumption being made here. I kind of grasped it, but not fully. And the implicit assumption is this. It is all human beings in all of history who have ever claimed to have a supernatural experience are either deluded, mistaken, or they are mentally ill. Deluded, mistaken, or mentally ill. These are the three categories that generally atheists are putting people into whenever they say that no gods exist. So they won't necessarily tell this to your face if you are a believer in a religion, but this is an assumption that they are making. And so when they are arguing with you, when they are debating with you about your particular faith tradition, they are simply saying, I think that you are one of these three things, and they are trying to figure out which one it is, right? And they're approaching you as if you do not have a good understanding of the world around you, and you are not properly being skeptical of your own intuitions. And I might pause here and say for a second that that's actually a pretty smart move. I think it's important for us to be skeptical of some of our own intuitions because we oftentimes make mistakes, right? Like we make mistakes every single day about things, assumptions about other people, assumptions about our future, assumptions about maybe stories that we've heard from others. And oftentimes we are mistaken. Sometimes we misread our senses, for example, where we will feel like maybe there's danger where danger doesn't actually exist. And so given this, they do have a good point. I think atheists have a very good point here. And I began to see that. And that was actually one of the reasons I began to shift my thinking quite a bit on atheism in general. So, but that implicit assumption is actually super important. And we'll return to that at the end of the video a little bit because that was actually the mechanism by which I returned back to faith. So we'll talk about that a little more at the end. But for now, we're going to move on to the next section, which is logic and reason. All right, I think we can all agree that logic and reason have yielded a lot of good to the world, whether it's through science or mathematics or through technology like what I have in front of me right now or what you're listening on right now. The coming up with a rigorous set of rules about how to think have helped humans develop quite a lot of great things that have pushed humanity what we would consider forward, right? So the idea of progress within humanity, whether it's like, for example, in medicine as well, has been driven by formalizing sets of rules about how to think. Now, I might jump in here and also say that logic and reason, if you have the wrong presuppositions, can oftentimes lead to really disastrous results. And this is why it's important to understand the rules of logic and reason and to understand that there's a difference between deductive and inductive reasoning. I'm not going to get into those now, but you can look those up if you'd like to, and how to properly apply them. Well, as I began to study the rules of logic and reason, and I began to realize that you can actually apply those to claims within Christianity or other religions and philosophy, I began to see that there were a lot of holes in the things that I had grown up thinking. And those holes got bigger and bigger to the point where I felt like something had to give. And this really caused a lot of internal conflict within me. Now, I might say there's another important point here that atheists will often bring up, and that is that just because you're dealing with internal conflict over an idea or some new information that you've encountered does not mean that that information that you have encountered is false, right? Throughout history, there have been a lot of what we call paradigm shifts, right? The one that's used over and over and over is the idea that the earth was flat versus the earth is a sphere, right? There was a major paradigm shift that occurred when people encountered information that showed that the earth was a sphere. And this caused a lot of internal conflict for a lot of people for religious reasons in many cases. So just because you're feeling internal conflict, because you're encountering some information, does not mean the information is false. And for a lot of people who are, deconvert from a religion, they will talk about this period of deep internal conflict as they are wrestling with their faith, right? And I began to go through this myself. And it was really rough. But I couldn't escape the fact that I'm not going to just return to my beliefs that I had growing up just because they made me feel comfortable. And it's not safe to just return to the beliefs you had growing up because it gives you influence in your community. That's not safe either, because if this were the case, then every single person should just remain in the religion that they grew up within. But Christianity teaches that people should deconvert from their current view and convert to Christianity. Do you see the conflict? And I didn't want to be a hypocrite about this. And so my thought was, well, okay, if I'm not going to be a hypocrite, I need to be willing to admit that maybe some of my beliefs are wrong as well. And this is tough. It's not an easy thing to do, but it was something I was committed to doing. So you've probably heard the phrase, I'm going to follow the evidence wherever it leads. Well, this is where my head was at this point. I was going to follow the evidence that I encountered, apply the rules of logic and reason, and follow it wherever it led. Well, as I proceeded in my study of all of these various aspects, I began to see that there were so many holes within all religious views that my faith was falling apart. And as my faith fell apart, I began to realize that there was a major difference between the methods that logic and reason use within science and mathematics and historical criticism, and the methods that most people within theology use to apply to how they approach theological topics. I'm going to give some examples here. You oftentimes hear people within a particular religious tradition, let's pick Catholicism, for example, and they will cite a saint 500 years ago who wrote something down, and they will almost cite it as if it must be true because that saint was very holy, right? Without taking a step back and saying, well, maybe that saint made a mistake, right? Maybe there's just a misunderstanding somewhere. It doesn't mean that just because somebody is popular within your religious tradition does not mean that something they said is true. Now let's compare that to, for example, let's say mathematics, right? In mathematics, when you want to prove something, you can't simply say, well, Bertrand Russell said that blah, blah, blah. Or you can't just simply say, well, Alan Turing stated something in a opinion piece about something, and since he's a great mathematician, therefore it must be true. Instead, there's a sense of rigor that's applied to the proofs in mathematics, in physics, in geometry, all of those topics. So for those of you that are watching that are maybe like a background of just being Christian, you may wonder why when people go to liberal arts schools, they tend to become more secular. And this is part of the reason why. If you've grown up with a lot of information that perhaps is hearsay or is not proven in some way, and then you encounter these methods where you can prove that things are true in a more rigorous way, you're going to eventually reach a point where you trust these methods over here in mathematics and science more than you trust the methods that you may have heard from your pastor growing up or from a theologian, because the methods are more rigorous on the mathematics side. And so this is personally why I think most people that go into upper levels of learning end up leaning more agnostic or atheist and more secular. There's another aspect to this as well, and that is that as we started to, as humans, apply the methods that we were learning of logic and reason to the natural world through science and mathematics and physics and all these things, so we started to discover that there were assumptions that were being made within religious traditions that might not be true. Great example would be mental illness versus demonic possession. So you'll hear the argument oftentimes that atheists will make that people used to believe that everybody was, there were demons everywhere. So there's the, what is that book, the demon haunted world or something like that. I can't remember the name right now off the top of my head, but anyway, the idea being that it used to be that what humans did was they attributed human-like qualities to natural phenomena. Okay. So rather than a person simply having a brain that is mentally ill, people traditionally would refer to that person as having a demon right? There's some other being that's influencing their behavior. Well, now we have enough knowledge to basically show that some people are mentally ill, right? This is an argument that is made oftentimes within atheist circles. And so that's a great example of how people shift in their trust of science as opposed to their trust of their theological tradition. And that was where my head was going as well. So that pretty much covers the logic and reason portion, and we're going to jump right now over into the how I began to study supernatural experiences from a different light. Supernatural experiences have happened all over the world to lots of different religions. You can find histories of supernatural experiences from everything from the Aztecs and Mayans over to China, India, and the ancient Near East, where the Judeo-Christian religions were born. And even if you go backwards in time to the era of the ancient Hebrews back in Egypt, there were supernatural experiences happening all over in Egypt that people were claiming to have. And as I began to study more in depth on that, I began to realize that most of the experiences that I had ever heard growing up were coming from within my particular very narrow fundamentalist Christian tradition, in the Protestant tradition in particular. And it's really uncomfortable, going back to the idea that sometimes we encounter uncomfortable evidence. It's uncomfortable to discover that other denominations within Christianity also have their supernatural experiences and their stories about these types of things. And Islam does too. And the ancient, the ancient Egyptians did too. And the people who are in Australia and, the native tribes from South America and from the Malaysian islands. And you get my drift, right? There's these things that are happening, and there's claims of these things happening all over. And what's tricky about it is that when I was growing up, I had been taught that all of these other experiences, right, all these other supernatural experiences that had happened, well, they're from the devil. But then you start to encounter some of the experiences that it doesn't really make sense to say they're from the devil, okay? So miracles, for example. There are stories of miracles happening from other sects within Christianity. There are stories of miracles happening outside of Christianity. How do we know which ones could trust? Why would the devil be performing miracles? And I began to realize that if you start to try to apply logic and reason to this, it becomes very difficult to pick and choose which ones of these supernatural experiences can be trusted. And at this point, you sort of have a decision that you're faced with. I was seeing three options. The first option is I'm just going to stubbornly continue to believe exactly what I was taught growing up because it's the most comfortable for me, right? That's decision one. I'm going to stick with what I was raised to believe because this is too confusing and it's just going to be easier for me if I just stick with that. Second decision, I'm going to reject all supernatural experiences that have ever happened across the world. And third is I'm going to say that maybe some of them happened, but it's impossible for us to know which ones can be trusted, right? I obviously chose option two. In the long run, to me, it just seemed like, okay, well, we know that some supernatural experiences can be explained using natural means. Let's go back to the mental illness versus demons thing. It might be easier to conclude that when somebody's having a demonic experience, that maybe they're just mentally ill, right? So if we can conclude that, perhaps all of the supernatural experiences that people have ever had simply were them misunderstanding things or being deluded or being mentally ill, right? So I just didn't think agnosticism really made a lot of sense. It was even more uncomfortable, I guess you could say, than rejecting all of them. And so at this point, this was one of the reasons that I became an atheist when looking at supernatural experiences. Okay, prophecies. Now, you might say, well, prophecies are supernatural experiences. Why does this get its own section? I think it's important to address because for most Christians that are defending the faith, they'll refer to the prophecies in the Old Testament about Jesus, and they will point out that this is a primary reason to trust that Jesus was actually who he said he was. And I'm going to jump in a little bit and just say that some of these prophecies were not as clear-cut as I thought that they would be. And I would challenge you, if you're interested, go look at some of the prophecies as they are outlined in the New Testament, and then look back to the passage in the Old Testament where they're referenced, and just see how many of them actually seem to make as much sense as the New Testament authors claim. Okay? Just as a practice, this might be something worth doing. When I did this, I discovered that in many cases, it looked a lot like the New Testament authors were just cherry picking verses from the Old Testament to make Jesus seem more credible. And then I began to look at the prophecies outside of the Bible. You know, there are a lot of people within like Pentecostal traditions in both the Protestant and Catholic traditions within the church. And these people will claim to have prophecies about the end of the world, about Christ's return. And in the last 2,000 years, almost all, if not all, of them have failed. Okay? And or to make matters more complicated, it seems like the more precise the prophecy was, the more likely it was to fail. So if I predict that next Tuesday, rain is going to start at exactly 1 p.m. Central Standard Time in Austin, Texas. Okay. And rain doesn't start exactly 1 p.m. Central Standard Time in Austin, Texas. My prophecy has failed, right? If I say that next Tuesday rain will start in Austin, Texas, though, that's more vague, right? There's a probability rain is going to happen on Tuesday anyway, so I might be right. And so what the atheists would say, and what I used to say, was that people are just, they're ignoring the misses and they're recording the hits. What I mean is that if I make 100 prophecies and 99 of them fail and one of them wins or actually does happen, we just ignore the 99 that failed and we'll just focus on the one that did happen, right? And so I began to look at all of the world religions and I realized that this was a common theme across all of them. And I will admit there were some that seemed fairly credible that didn't seem to, you know, they were more trustworthy perhaps than others. However, to me, it just seemed like, well, if enough people are making enough prophecies, some of them are eventually going to come true, right? And there was no way to prove that the person didn't just have a good guess, right? Maybe they just had a good guess and it would be easier to say, well, you know, people are guessing things all the time. I mean, I guess if you want to predict that maybe a war is going to begin between this country and that country in 2 years from now, well, the probability a war may happen, so maybe you're going to get it right. And so from that standpoint, since there was no way to prove, again, going back to that, the types of proof, right? Since there was no way to prove that somebody saying something was actually linked beforehand to the thing that was occurring in the future, then it would be just safer to say that perhaps the person just made a good guess. I'm going to add one other thing here, though. And there was a discovery, or maybe not a discovery, but just something that I decided for myself. And that was that how would you know whether some information that was given to someone was actually coming from an external being? And let's be fair, all prophecies are claiming to come from an external being. How would you know? And the only way you could do this is if some information was planted into somebody's head and there was no possible way on the planet they could have access to that information in a natural way at that point in time, right? This would be the safest way to conclude this, that they actually had information from an external being. So the reason that I think this is important is because oftentimes we have subconscious information that's given to us, right? So for example, let's say you're passively listening to the radio while you're driving in the car and you're not really thinking about what's on the radio, and someone says something on the radio, right? You're not paying attention. And then a couple hours later, you subconsciously think that subconscious idea boils up into your conscious brain. And now you feel like you encountered some new information, right? So you've got, I'm trying to think of a good example of this, but the idea being that you were subconsciously influenced by something someone said on the radio that made you think that you had some special information given to you later. That would be an example of a situation where you thought you had information given to you from external being, but maybe it was just passively influenced somewhere else, right? I realized that, well, if you had no opportunity to receive the information from any source in your life, and that information was given to you, then that information must have come from an external source. Now, if you remember in my story, this actually happens, right? So if you go back to my story and the dream with Padre Pio, that was an example of information that I could not have possibly accessed in any way that was given to me that ended up becoming true later. So feel free to go back and look at that. But that was something that did confirm to me that maybe prophecies could be real. So I also had the whole deliverance message thing that happened where that information was given to me, and I wrote it down. So I do now believe that prophecies can happen, that beings can give information externally. But this was something that I learned when I was looking through all the prophecy stuff. So. All right, now we're going to move on to the next section here, and that is going to be history. Historical criticism is a really important part of trying to understand what is in the Bible. And so for me, I was going to Moody Bible Institute, and I felt like it was important to understand how we can determine what the Bible is saying using methods like historical criticism. And historical criticism is a really broad topic, and this may be a little longer chapter here. But the goal of historical criticism is to try and figure out what things written in history are true and which things are folklore or legend. And on top of that, to also try and figure out when something is written, what was meant by what was written. For the Bible, this is a particularly hot topic because a lot of times the wording that is used in the Bible is difficult to understand. And this was kind of surprising to me. I thought that, most of the passages in the Bible, like scholars had all figured out. And it was surprising to me to discover there are words in the Bible where scholars don't know what they mean. And I had been raised in this tradition that the Bible was the inerrant word of God, that the original texts were like perfectly inspired in every possible way. The phrase where Jesus says not one jot or iota would pass away before everything was fulfilled. And so to discover that there are some problems with this process is really, it shakes your faith if you grow up with that. Some examples. So for example, you learn that the book of Jeremiah, there were 2 copies of it. And the book of Jeremiah says that. And the first copy was destroyed, right? So if the original texts are the only inspired ones, but the original text was destroyed, and then Jeremiah wrote another one, then that argument kind of doesn't really hold up anymore. On top of that, you have this idea within the Protestant fundamentalist Christian tradition that it was the original autographs, or the term for the actual original writings, right, that were perfectly inspired. And then they will say that, well, we don't have those anymore. So of course we're going to have some errors maybe in the grammar and the spelling and stuff in our modern ones. But to me, this just seemed like a cop-out. I was like, okay, so what you're saying is that there's a perfect document that was created and then God let it be destroyed, right? And I was like, that doesn't really make a lot of sense, right? So when trying to look at the text in the Bible, I began to start to think like Bart Ehrman, who also went to Moody Bible Institute for a period. And I began to think, well, okay, so if we have these copies that are passed down, even if those copies contain, even if those copies all kind of agree with each other today, that doesn't mean that they match what the original autograph said. I'll give an example. Let's say that I send you a message, right? And I write down a paragraph. And then you send that message to your friends, right? But the friend, when he sends the message, changes something in it. And then you delete the text message that you had on your phone. And then that friend sends that as a blast to a bunch of other people, okay? The original has been destroyed. All of the friends have copies now that are all mistaken, right? Now the original message is completely gone. The only person on the planet that could resolve the issue would be me, right? You could go back to me and you could say, well, Josh, what did you originally say? Well, that's great because I'm still alive. But what do you do if, for example, Paul wrote a letter and then that letter got distributed around, and then people, maybe somebody copied the letter, Paul's letter, and then destroyed the original got destroyed. Maybe it burned down in a fire, or maybe like it got water on it or something, and they threw it out. And then that copied one, right, and had errors in it, and now it got all copied, right? Or perhaps, there's a lot of stuff that can happen in a period of 20 to 30 years, and most of the copies that we have of the books in the Bible or passages within the Bible are hundreds of years later than when they were written originally, which means there's a lot of time where errors could have crept in. And I couldn't resolve this. I was like, well, okay, there doesn't seem to be anything magical about this. And how can we prove that these actually match the originals? And on top of it, I began to study some of the arguments that people made about the text. And I realized that, well, there's actually some stuff in there that looks like it was added later. So you can find stories where it looks like scribes actually did change things, right? I had been raised to believe that the scribes were incredibly careful with everything they did. And this was like repeated over and over and over. It was somewhat of an argument from sophistry, right? Like the idea that like, well, I'm going to impress you with the emotional appeal that all these scribes must have done like a really good job, and they rarely ever made mistakes. And I think there were probably periods where that was true. But again, you can go to the Old Testament and you can find passages that actually say that some of the scribes weren't trustworthy, right? So not all the scribes were like this. This was not always the case, which meant that you do have cases where, information is added into the text because a scribe thought that it made more sense that way. Or you can find examples where it looks like a scribe tweaked a theological point in a passage to more closely match what was taught at that time when the scribe was living. And I began to think, well, if that's the case, then how can we trust any of this stuff, right? Like, how can we trust any of the claims that are in there? When the Bible quotes Jesus, is that a direct quote or is that a paraphrase? And if it's a paraphrase, how do we know that it accurately matches what Jesus originally said? And on top of that, you have the fact that some of the Greek words could potentially have multiple meanings. We have this all the time in English, right? Where certain words have multiple meanings. And so, people use euphemisms to refer to things. They use figures of speech. How can we prove that the figures of speech that were used by the authors or people like Jesus actually mean what we think they mean, right? And you can go down quite a bit of a rabbit hole on all of these topics. And there are, thousands of topics that can be discussed in relation to Bible passages. And in some cases, scholars still today don't know exactly what the Bible passage is talking about, right? And so people are making educated guesses. And oftentimes the educated guesses are being influenced by the tradition of the church that the person comes from. And I realized there was a bit of circular reasoning here, right? If I grow up believing that, I'm having a hard time thinking of a specific example right now, but if I grow up believing, here we go. If I grow up believing that the body and blood of the Lord are literally in the Eucharist, they're literally in the bread and the wine, right? And then I encounter a passage of scripture that seems confusing on the topic, I may take my assumption and read it into the text rather than the other way around. The term that's often used for this is eisegesis. So eisegesis is where I read into something what I want it to say. Exegesis is where you're extracting out the information. And so, I learned this at Moody Bible Institute, and it was really uncomfortable to discover that the process of exegesis was not nearly as trustworthy as I thought it was. And, you say, well, Josh, we have the Holy Spirit to help us out with this, right? The problem is that you look across the Christian traditions, and oftentimes people will claim that the Holy Spirit is leading them to a particular interpretation, and then they'll come up two people will claim the same thing and come up with a different interpretation. So how are we supposed to determine how anything is true? This really, really frustrated me quite a bit, because it's one thing to make arguments like I have about the supernatural experiences and stuff. It's even more difficult when we aren't even sure whether the descriptions of the supernatural experiences are accurate or whether they've been tampered with. And so a lot of atheists at this point will say, well, we can't trust the stories of the resurrection because the Gospels disagree on these things. And there are some apparent disagreements in there, and I agree with it. And then I begin to notice that, well, okay, there's a lot of scholars that try to resolve all of these issues, but there's one major problem with all of the resolutions. And that is that in many cases, or in most cases, you can propose a resolution to two passages in the Bible that maybe disagree with each other. Great example is how Judas died, right? You know, one passage says that he hung himself, and another passage said he fell over and, basically his body exploded, for lack of a better way to put it. And so you can come up with an explanation that, well, Judas hung himself and then he fell from hanging and then his body exploded, right? But that's not what either one of the texts say. So by coming up with one of these resolutions, you're actually adding information to the text that was not actually there. And there's also no way to prove that your explanation is the correct one, right? So the atheist position would be, it is safer to assume that maybe somebody made a mistake, right? Well, this is very difficult for most Christians to accept, because the idea that the Bible, or God's word, as it is often called, is perfect is destroyed if you assume that somebody could make a mistake in what they wrote. This really tore my faith apart, probably more than all of the other things I discovered. Applying the methods of historical criticism led me to the point where I concluded that the Bible is no more trustworthy than any other ancient historical document, and in some cases might actually be less trustworthy, because the people who were recording it, or the scribes that were copying it, were heavily influenced to modify the contents to fit their theological views, which is something that people still do today. That tore me apart. And I don't really have much else to add on that right at this point in time, so we'll probably move on to the next section here. But I will tell you that this doesn't bother me anymore for a variety of reasons, which I may address in a future video. So let's move on to the next section, and that is morality. When we think of morals, we normally think of what is right and wrong. When we think of biblical morals, or Christian morals, we normally think of what God has told us is right and wrong. However, in the modern day, we have a lot of morals that we have reasoned our way to. An example would be the abolition of slavery, right? In the Old Testament, slavery is assumed to be a worldwide phenomena, and there are no prohibitions against slavery. Instead, there are rules about how good slavery works, right? I'm not going to get into the details about all of this. I'm going to simply make a point that I encountered when I was becoming an atheist, and that is quite simply this. If the modern understanding of slavery is the morally correct one, that all slavery is wrong, that any humans owning another person is wrong, why didn't God tell us this several thousand years ago? Could have simply said it, right? God could have simply outlined how to perform modern economics in a way that would be different than all of the other nations, and Israel could have implemented an economic system that did not involve slavery, right? That would have been a possibility. And if God can do anything, why didn't he do it, right? And I looked at this and a variety of other topics, like, for example, I don't know that there's a single passage in the Bible that actually prohibits or says anything about a particular age at which you can get married or have sexual relations with a person, right? Yet we have modern laws around this. Why doesn't the Bible specify this? If if it's so important and it is a moral issue that really gets a lot of modern people in an uproar, God could have simply said, hey, yeah, no sexual relationships with anyone below the age of, 15 or something, right? And this just caused a lot of conflict for me, because I began to see that, well, if we have a lot of modern morals that come from reasoning, why do we need any divine revelation for any morals? Can't we use reasoning for all of them? And so this was part of the reason I got very interested in Sam Harris, who was many years ago addressing this topic quite a bit, where he's talking about a moral landscape that involved the reduction of harm, or the minimization of harm, or the increase of human flourishing, I believe is what he called it as well. And the idea was that we can disregard any divine revelation traditions, all of the Abrahamic faiths, any of them in the world that talk about what is right and wrong, and instead we can come up with our own morals based upon reason. I will be honest, I did never reach a point where I was completely comfortable with any of the reasoning on this, because it did feel, even when I was an atheist, it did feel like there really was no good foundation for morals without somebody saying that something was right or wrong. In other words, it felt to me like morals were something that required somebody that was going to judge what was happening. And a lot of the morals that we have seemed very dependent upon whether there was an afterlife, because if you can get away with something, was it really wrong? So I will admit that this caused me a lot of trouble, and it made me, this line of reasoning that I've just explained did lead me to reject the morals that were outlined in the Bible. But I never felt fully comfortable with morality or any of the explanations of morality while I was an atheist. But I will point out a couple other things here. So we have a lot of biblical morals that are outlined that we no longer follow. There are a lot of rules about how marriage works in the Old Testament. There's the concept of concubines in the Old Testament, for example. We have the idea of polygamy in the Old Testament, and even during the era when Jesus was on the earth, that were not questioned or prohibited until, best I can tell, Paul comes along and makes the hint that a person should be a one-woman man, right? Which is a rather interesting twist. So the idea that morality is a fixed thing throughout time doesn't really make a lot of sense. And if there's a God who exists, who is creating some sort of objective morality, one would expect that morality would be fixed, right? Like that the behaviors that are right or wrong would not just shift from year to year. So that was another reason that I also the whole idea of following a divinely revealed morality just kind of fell apart for me at the time. And so this was another reason why I became an atheist. So the next section we're going to talk about here is going to be science. Science is a massive topic, and I am not going to go too in-depth on this one, because this is probably the one that's been beaten to death so much in debates and arguments, and you got the whole evolution versus creation debate and all that stuff. I would probably say that in the majority of online discourse, this one probably takes the biggest chunk of the pie. So I'm sure you can easily find information on this. I tended to agree with the majority of the atheist positions on this, and that was that science is a much better way to determine what is true in the world than any forms of claimed divine revelation that have happened in the past. And this just seems to be the way most atheists think, and it was the way I thought as well. I will say that you might ask the question, well, science is a gift from God, right? You might say, well, God has given us a gift of thinking in this natural world that we live in. Why would you conclude that just because we can study things with science that God must not exist? And it comes down to a fairly simple argument, and that argument is there are a lot of dangerous things for humans in the world. For example, there are a lot of plants that we can't eat because they're poisonous. Why did God nowhere in history divinely reveal to us all the poisonous plants? I mean, he could have done that, right? Like, why not? Why does God let us test certain things in human history through the process of death? Doesn't make a lot of sense. And so for me, that was a big linchpin in me being like, well, okay, it sure seems like most of the people that were in history were simply using the best information they had at the time, and they were interpreting natural things as if they were supernatural. So it's probably safe to assume that the gods that they claimed were behind these revelations didn't actually exist. In conclusion, I became an atheist because I saw problems from the logic and reasoning perspective, from the historical perspective, from the morality perspective, from the science perspective, in addressing the claims of Christianity. And it seemed safer to me that there were no gods than to conclude that one particular one is true. So this was a very difficult process for me. I deconverted from Christianity. It was very painful, very difficult to come out to my family about this, very difficult to come out to my friends. I ended up having to shut down my Facebook because people were attacking me so much. And I did mention at the beginning that there was this implicit assumption that I made. And that implicit assumption was that all supernatural claims that had ever been made in history were either delusions or a misunderstanding, or they were mental illness, right? And this is a pretty big assumption because it assumes that no supernatural experiences could possibly come from a non-human intelligence, right? It had occurred to me that perhaps there was the possibility that there were non-human intelligences that existed that were interacting with us. And maybe we were just misunderstanding what they were saying, or we were, I don't know, maybe there was a backstory to humanity that was more complicated than any of the religions wanted to say. And that was why I originally said the prayer that I did when I became an atheist. It was basically me reaching out and saying, okay, all right, all religions have some form of prayer, or most religions do. And so if there's anything listening, I'm going to say this prayer and give an opportunity for them to show up and basically prove to me that they're there. As you know from my other story, this actually happened. And it happened with a series of supernatural events that were undeniable to be, and that involved witnesses, and that were very profound. That is why I now believe again. And so you can probably imagine it was very difficult for me to go back and be like, wow, I made one fundamental mistake. One of my axioms in my understanding of the universe was wrong. I had built up an entire mental model of reality while I was an atheist that was now crumbling down in front of me. And that's painful, right? Whenever you have a belief system and you encounter evidence to the contrary, and you've built an entire life off of that belief system, it's painful to have that thing fall down. And that's what happened. I mean, it was really, really rough. Like, it was not pleasant at all. But so hopefully I can discuss that more in another video here. But this idea of this implicit assumption is super important. So if you're an atheist watching this, I want you to maybe take some time, go back, watch my other video, and take a look at it. Because the process of coming out of this definitely shook my understanding of the world. And I realized that perhaps there is some evidence, so there's some data out there that is not logical in the way that we normally think about logic. And one of the things I learned was that there's an aspect to the interaction between heaven and earth that's very symbolic, that is not necessarily designed to meet our logical thought processes all the time. And that's why a lot of the ancient revelations were visions or dreams. There was more going on than somebody simply outlining something in a white paper, for a scientific community. So yeah. Anyway, thank you for watching this video. I'm hoping to do another video a little bit on my thought process as I came out of atheism and as I started to piece everything back together, because I think there are good answers to a lot of the stuff that I brought up and why I became an atheist in this video. So hope you stick around, and thank you for watching.